welcome back to the second half of lecture for chapter 2. We're going to pick up with why do some places face health threats at different rates than other places do. So here is a picture from Asunción, Paraguay, with a sign about preventing dengue fever, which is spread through mosquito bites. And so we're going to ask, why do some countries have to face these kind of disease threats and health threats that other places do not? And we want to know what kinds of health problems these places have and what are the implications for population change. And then also, can places experience population decline due to health problems? And so much like we had the demographic transition model, we also have an epidemiologic transition that is roughly aligned with the demographic transition model. So that stage one that no country is in right now is just a bunch of pestilence and famine, disease, lots of people dying, really no protection from kind of any of these factors. In stage two, what you have is you still have some of these diseases, but you have these receding pandemics. So things like cholera, which you can have cholera outbreaks due to sanitation problems, or things like Ebola. Ebola is actually really difficult to spread. You have to have pretty close contact with a person. It is not an airborne disease, but Ebola spreads in some sub-Saharan African countries because of a kind of lack of education about the disease and a lack of infrastructure. And then in stage three, you wind up with degenerative diseases, things like cancer or heart disease, generally speaking, diseases that are related to living longer. And then in stage four, you get delayed degenerative diseases. So basically, again, these degenerative diseases like cancer and heart disease, but through modern medicine, we're able to delay or offset the effects of these diseases in order to increase life expectancy. Globalization kind of threatens to disrupt this typical transition because if you think about it, now we're able to get on a plane and fly around the world in a day and take potentially diseases with us. And so, during the Ebola outbreak, you wound up with somebody with Ebola in the United States. Although we are able to stop the transmission right there, people are generally worried about kind of spread of disease through this globalization process. And the two other things that we want to think about are life expectancy and infant mortality. So life expectancy being on average, how long are the citizens of your country living? Really high in places like Japan. Japan, the life expectancy is 85.3 years. Really low in less developed, poorer places like Chad. In Chad, it's just a little over 50 years life expectancy. And then infant mortality. So infant mortality is children who are dying within their first year of life. So really low, again, in Japan and places like Iceland, 2 for every 1,000 births, which is incredibly low, as opposed to really high in places like Afghanistan, which is 111 for every 1,000 children who are born, right? If you have less access to medicine, especially vaccinations, a lot of children can die from some pretty preventable diseases. And then you also have to look at things like the HIV/AIDS epidemic. So the HIV/AIDS epidemic has altered population structures, especially in places in sub-Saharan Africa. So we had several southern African countries experience a decline in the past from AIDS. So lots of people of a working age who are dying from the disease. And so you can see here in Botswana where you had this is a projected population structure for 2020, But this is what it would have looked like without HIV/AIDS, and this is what it is expected to look like with HIV/AIDS, although this is now projected to be a little bit better due to increasing education. And there are several reasons why HIV/AIDS spreads in some of these places. Some of it is cultural, where contraception is not considered to be an okay thing to ask your partner to wear. Some of it is education, particularly if you have structures that are spreading misinformation about the disease. And then access to medication. So you can really decrease the transmission of HIV through basically a drug cocktail of antivirals, which most people in these countries cannot afford. Um, so in South Africa, the life expectancy overall um, has gone up from the mid 50s to 63.8 as that situation is improving, but it leads to all kinds of social and economic problems. Basically, you have this decreased human capital, and so you're removing large portions of an entire generation um, that can progress the country and be part of the workforce and carry on kind of cultural traditions. We also have population decline for different reasons, such as in Eastern Europe. So this, when the Soviet Union declined and then collapsed, and then all the countries that were part of the Soviet Union as well, birth rates declined. Excuse me, there was a lot of poverty and kind of instability, and death rates rose. Medicine was very costly at this time, and vodka was very cheap. So you have lots of issues with alcoholism. The government at one point had to slap a minimum price on vodka because it was just so incredibly cheap. Also, there was relatively cheap access to heroin and prostitution, which led to kind of the spread of HIV as well, which led to increased death rates. Um, and so for about 20 years, and this is just recently crossed over again, this is the cross that it's referring to, death rates surpassed birth rates. So you had this population decline. And so what does the future hold for population? It is still growing pretty rapidly, although the rate of growth is slowing. And the question is this sustainable? Can we sustain more people on this planet? And what is our carrying capacity? So previous estimates were wrong. There's this guy Malthus, who had this theory that quite some time ago that we would have surpassed our resources, which would have led to kind of mass starvation and war over competition of resources. But food production has been able to grow faster than population. We've gotten exceedingly good at growing food, but there are other resources as well. Um, Also, the planet does have a physiological limit for food production. Eventually, we will run out of arable land and our ability to grow food on it. But if you can see India, which has a very large population, right? India's food production of rice and wheat. Here is rice in the blue, wheat in the yellow, and red is their population. They have been able to completely keep up with their population growth and been able to grow enough food. Other resources are not used as sustainably if you think about things like fossil fuels. Those least developed countries are growing the fastest. Here is Nigeria. Here's a population projection for them. They have fewer resources available, but they have lower rates of consumption. And what I mean by lower rates of consumption is generally they use less things, they use less energy. Um, Europe and the United States have very high rates of consumption. We buy a lot of things, we use a lot of things, we use a lot of technology, we use a lot of fossil fuels. And so, what happens when these countries are kind of lifted out of poverty and start to develop? Generally speaking, they're going to start using more resources. Some countries have attempted to do things to help with their population growth. In China, they had something called the one child policy. And so the one child policy in China was basically that if you had more than one child, you had to pay a pretty heavy tax to the government. And so this led to this being kind of applied unevenly because, as you can imagine, poor people could not afford to have more than one child. Um, and so in the 1980s, those urban couples were limited to one child. They had large fines. There were some rural exemptions for farming. It did slow growth, and now they have a two-child policy instead. India is the world's largest democracy, so a law like this would be impossible. Nobody would vote to pass a law to limit the amount of children they could have in a place like India, and so India's population growth is expected to outpace China's eventually. They are also more rural, more agricultural, and generally speaking, have more babies. Again, they're expected to pass China around 2025. And when we look at China's population, um, we can see here again less children, people living longer. We're going to have that kind of graying of that population as well. And what this has led to in China is kind of these unbalanced sex ratios where you have more men than women. You have a Chinese and Indian culture which favors boys generally. They care for their parents in old age. Girls aren't seen as having as much earning potential to take care of the family. And generally speaking, when you marry off your daughter, you have to pay a price to do so. So some of the consequences of that, there was a lot of selective abortion. In fact, ultrasounds that told you the sex of your child were outlawed. Lots of cases of horrible cases of infanticide, where people would have a baby and were murdering little girls because they could not take care of them, or having gotten pregnant with a second child and not being able to afford the price. Um, and so lots of abandonment of girls as well. This is a station in China where you can abandon a baby, kind of no questions asked, which the government put up in order to deal with this problem of infanticide. But it's almost always girls that are being abandoned at these locations. And then you wind up with these kind of little emperors. So when you have only one child, one boy, who is carrying on the entire family, they tend to become the focus of that entire family. And then also problems with human trafficking, because now you have these, more boys than women. These boys grow up and they need brides. And so now women are being trafficked into China to fill that gap. There's also kind of this potential stage five in the demographic transition model. This is kind of like, where are we going? So in countries like Japan, which it's highly urban, 93.5% urban, really high cost of living. You have few working mothers, so women who are working but generally not interested in having children as much. The birth rate is very, very low, and you have this really long life expectancy. So you can look again, here's 1950, lots of young people. Then those people are reaching mature age, and now they are in 2050 projected to be a huge portion of the population. And then you have a very, very high dependency ratio of 64%. Very little immigration into Japan for a variety of reasons. And so, generally speaking, you need people to immigrate into these countries to kind of fill that hole. And we'll talk about that when we get to migration. But again, here's the population structure of Japan, a little animation here. And so we're thinking about, where are they? Here's stage five, where your population is going to decline. Here's your population. So that is the end of chapter 2. You're now going to move on to watch a TED Talk by one of my favorite speakers who passed away a couple of years ago, Hans Rosling, talking about the links between population growth and environmental sustainability and health outcomes. That is a really great talk, and I hope that you enjoy it.